Hey everyone, welcome back to JP's Budget Collecting and our weekly look back at the hot comics from 6 months ago. This week we're looking back at the hot comics from January 5th, 2024. So we've moved into 2024 on our look back, and I'm recording this on July 4th, 2024. So happy Independence Day, even though it'll be a couple days later when you see this. As always, I give you those dates so you know when this information is actually most relevant, because the market is always moving and changing, as you will see when we look back at these the prices of these books then versus now. This week, we're only looking back at the CBSI Hot Top 10. Tom did put out a video this week, or that week, I should say, but it was a 2023 recap list. And the way they put it together, it didn't really match with the way I typically do these, so I didn't include those books here. Because some of those books were already down quite a bit in value, even when Tom was talking about them being the hottest books of the year overall. So, we only got 10 books to talk about, so it shouldn't take us too long. As always, we're just trying to see what made these books hot, what factors were affecting them then, and what has affected them since that made it worth your while to be patient, or should you have chased those books in the moment. So let's dig in and see if we can learn anything this week. First up, we got Godzilla #1 from 1977, first Godzilla in American comics, and this was because Godzilla -1 was a huge success back in December. People thought that movie was amazing, plus the Monarch show was coming out at that time, so there was just a lot of love for Godzilla going on last winter. Back then, raw copies were $70 to $100. 9.8 was hitting almost $600 at $588 for a high sale. Now it's a $20 to $80 book for raw. 9.8, $4 to $550. So down in a trap on that 9.8, because most of the sales are under 500. That's enough of a step back. But you could argue with me, maybe I should just call them I'll be back, because the raw sales are really just a more general step back. Although most of them are more like $40, $50 now, as opposed to that $70 to $100 back then. So Godzilla's definitely taking a step back. Still a book that's, got a lot of value. We're just closer to what its long term is now that we're away from the hype of the movie. Next, we're going to have 3 covers to talk about. The first of our covers is Predator versus Wolverine, #4. The Joshua Cassera 1 in 25. This book was hitting the list back then at 40 to 70. So basically for all intents and purposes, between double and triple ratio. Usually that means it's going to end up between ratio and double ratio, which would make the book a trap. This one's done a little better than that. It's a $35 to $60 book now. So there are sales between double and triple ratio, but there's still a few sales that are above double ratio. So we're going to just call this as I'll be back on this front. 9.8, 70 to 100. I said steady I'll be back. It's probably down and I'll be back. But, sometimes you're splitting hairs about deciding whether or not how much a book is really backed up. So next we have Fall of the House of X, #1, the Artgerm 1 in 50 Magic cover. Back then, this 1 in 50 was going for 80 to 120, which means it's sitting right around double ratio on average, which means it's probably going to end up around ratio. And that's what we're looking at now. It's a $30 to $80 book, with the average being around that $50, $60 mark. 9.8, 70 to 140, so there's actually 9.8 sale less than one of the raw sales. So we're going to call this down in a trap. One of Artgerm's better covers, I think, in recent memory. I do really like this Magic cover, but yeah, it's definitely not held value. Or at least held the kind of value it had back then, I should say. Next, we have our last cover is Shazam, #7, the David Nakayama 125. Me talk good. Back then, this cover was $40 to $70 for this 125 of Mary Marvel. So again, basically around double ratio. Now it's a $35 to $50 book, which is between ratio and double ratio. So we're going to call this down and I'll be back. So yeah, I can get where you could say why I called this one down and I didn't call that Predator Wolverine one down. Mainly because there's no sales kind of above that $50 mark, where there were for that other. But, all right. Next, we got some Comic Buzz stuff. Actually, quite a bit of Comic Buzz, which is kind of rare. We got Beneath the Trees Where Nobody Sees, #1, back on the list again, for like the I don't know. Let's see. I did write down 4th week in a row that it had been on the list. By last week, raw copies had jumped all the way up to 100 for some high sales. Now had settled in at this point at around 60. But 9.8, which last week were like 100 to 150, by this point we're up to 200. So the raws had started coming down a little bit at this point, but the 9.8s were still surging higher. So that's why I hit the list again. Now it's a $40 to $60 book, 9.8, 1 to 125. So most of the sales are still raw, so we're going to call it a down and I'll be back. But obviously that 9.8 is pushing dumpster fire range, definitely a trap at compared to those $200 sales. And there's quite a few sales. Most of them are like $115, but there are quite a few sales between that $100 and $125 mark right now. It'd be interesting to see what this book does. It's gotten a lot of love and still sustaining value pretty well. Does this become a stray dogs and eventually just fade and fade and fade until people aren't paying anything for it? Or does it hold better long term? We will see. Next, we have Beneath the Trees Where Nobody Sees #2. So by this point, the second issue was also hitting the list, going for $20 to $25 for raw copies. Now it's a $20 to $60 book. Only one 9.8 sale, $60 there, so not a lot to judge based on that. But this one is actually basically, there's definitely some lower sales than for #1, but the high end is going, on raw copies, is going for the same price as #1, which I find a little surprising, but this isn't up straight cash compared to what it was 6 months ago. So again, it'll be interesting to see how Beneath the Trees continue. Does it continue to sustain this kind of interest and value as we move further and further away from a miniseries? Just have to see. All right, next, our last kind of comic buzz, plus sort of a little bit of cover. I guess it's not our last comic buzz, but a comic buzz / cover one. This is Kid Venom Origins #1, the Luciano Viccecchio secret variant. A lot of interest in this Kid Venom, but really it was just collecting like the backup stories that had already been printed. So there wasn't a lot of new here in this Origins book. Raw copies back then were going for $30 to $40 on this kind of secret variant. Now it's a $15 to $30 with, well, $35. 15 to 35 with most of the sales under 30. 9.8, 80 to 100. This is definitely a down, and I'll be back and really almost into that trap range. Probably should have put this as a trap, honestly, because most of the sales are like 20-ish, 25, as opposed to, 30, 35. But definitely a book that's backed up. We'll see what happens if Kid Venom actually becomes something, or if it's just kind of one of those things people had an interest in for a while and eventually just kind of fades into the background. Next, we have Marvel Spotlight #5, first appearance of Ghost Rider. And this was hitting the list back then because there were rumors that we were getting a new Ghost Rider. I think that's already played out. I don't know. Anyway, back then a 6.5 jumped up to 1,500, which wasn't a huge jump. It's because it had been typically running around 13 back before that. So that's not a huge jump for a book like this. We know now we've gotten some additional rumors in the MCU. This was actually on the list last week or the week before, I forget now. So this book has been pretty hot, but it's still kind of a steady I'll be back even from then, because the 6.5 is now like 1,075 to 1,360. So it's back in that range of what it was before we had that $1,500 sale. Raw copies here, $250 all the way to $1,400 on recent sales on eBay. Obviously, this is very grade dependent in terms of what those values go for. Overall, we're just going to call this a steady and I'll be back. You definitely could have found some deals, but this is a classic book that's really, not going to drop too much under any circumstances. Next, we have Daredevil #9, first appearance of Echo, second week in a row here. Echo back on the list as her show was coming out. By this point, it was a $70 to $90 book, up from like $60 to $80 last week when we talked about it. 9.8, so it jumped significantly. They were up $240 to $250, where it had been like a $150 to $200 book when we talked about last week. Now it's a $20 to $75 book. 9.8, 80 to 175. This is down in a trap. Has not sustained the value of during the show, which in and of itself was way down from the value like when she first appeared in Hawkeye, and we got announcements and stuff. So yeah, this book has continued to back up, and I don't know how much lower the floor is, but it's definitely like, I would just be looking for deals if you're interested in Echo. And then our last book, because we only got 10 books this week, is Amazing Spider-Man number 50, first appearance of Kingpin. And of course, this had to do with rumors about the Daredevil show and about Kingpin obviously appearing in the Echo show, and like just a bunch, just a lot of interest in Kingpin at that point. 7.5 going for $1,900 back then. Now 7.5 will cost you $17 to $2,000, so this is very much steady worth it. Raw copies right now, recent sales 15 to 8 or 150 to 800. You probably, if you got a really high grade, would have to pay 15 for something. But yeah, 150 to $800 for recent raw sales. So overall, another steady, kind of worth it book, a classic book, straight cash book, long term. All right, so that is this week's list. Again, we just had the 10 books, but we had some variation. We had some covers, we had some movie stuff with Godzilla, we had some MCU stuff. So I want to thank you guys for watching, and we will catch you next time. Later.